On January 8, 1959, Fidel Castro came to power in Cuba, overthrowing the unpopular U.S.-friendly dictator Fulgencio Batista, thus cementing a communist influence over the island of Cuba. Castro then began to cut off ties with the previous regime's ally, the United States. Castro began developing close ties with the Soviet Union, most notably at exporting Cuba's crude oil to Russia. At the same time, the Cubans began to nationalize their own sugar plantations and mills, which were the main U.S. assets on the island. The United States was wary of a neighboring communist stronghold, Castro's ties to Nikita Khrushchev, and their sudden loss of economic viability.
Newly elected President John F. Kennedy continued the foreign policies of his predecessor Eisenhower with regard to the Cuban island, just miles offshore from Florida. Containment was in full effect, and JFK was hell-bent on eradicating communist influence in the Western Hemisphere.
President Kennedy was briefed by the CIA on a plan created during the Eisenhower administration which called for the training of Cuban exiles who would later lead an attack on Cuba. The operation called for 2 distinct airstrikes that would drop bombs, as well as land a 1,400-man surprise invasion force comprised of Cuban exiles. This group of Cuban exiles formed Brigade 2506. Paratroopers would be dropped before the invasion to disrupt enemy troop supply lines. While this was happening, a smaller force would land on the east end of the island to confuse the Cubans. The plan anticipated that the Cuban people and parts of the Cuban military would support the invasion. The primary goal was to overthrow Castro and to establish a non-communist government friendly to the U.S.
On April 19th, President Kennedy ordered an airstrike with 6 unmarked fighter planes. But due to confusion caused by a change in time zones between Nicaragua and Cuba, the attack was unsuccessful. Brigade 2506 landed on the beach along the Bay of Pigs and came under heavy fire from the Cuban military. In addition, JFK made the decision to not send the second round of air support that was promised because news of the invasion was leaked to the American public after the media gained access to pictures of the repainted planes.
Mr. President, it's the Situation Room.
Don't send the planes.
Within 24 hours, 20,000 Cuban troops overwhelmed the group of exile, killing 100 and capturing over 1,200. These prisoners remained captive for another 20 months until Attorney General RFK negotiated a deal with the Cuban government. The U.S. would give $53 million in baby food and pharmaceuticals in return for the prisoners.
The botched invasion was humiliating for the JFK administration and cemented the fragile relations the United States would have with Cuba for the remainder of the Cold War and still today. Furthermore, it was one of the distinct factors that led to the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1961, an event which almost ended in global nuclear destruction.